Every human story begins in one place, Africa. But why did evolution choose this continent and nowhere else on Earth? Tonight we'll uncover the landscapes, climates, and ancient forces that shaped the first humans. If you enjoy learning about our origins, please like, subscribe, and share, and tell us in the comments which part of human evolution fascinates you the most. Thank you for watching. Now let's begin. Africa stands as one of Earth's oldest and most stable landmasses, a geological survivor whose foundation has remained largely unbroken for billions of years. Beneath its deserts, forests, and savannas lie ancient cores of rock known as cratons, immense blocks of continental crust that formed during the Archean Eon, when the planet itself was young and molten. These cratons, including the Kapval Zimbabwe-Congo and West African masses, are fragments of a primeval Earth that have resisted subduction and destruction through nearly half the planet's history. Over time, smaller fragments collided and fused, welding together the continental heart that would one day shape the course of human evolution. The physical endurance of these cratons gave Africa geological continuity when other regions fractured and drifted apart. Their stability also meant that surface processes, weathering erosion and sediment accumulation, could sculpt the land through immense spans of time without being reset by cataclysmic upheaval. Around these ancient cores, belts of younger rocks record the scars of long-vanished mountain ranges, their roots now exposed in high plateaus and deep valleys. The story of Africa's crust is therefore not one of constant motion, but of deep endurance, a foundation that quietly persisted as oceans opened and closed around it. This underlying stillness provided an unbroken platform on which rivers could carve channels, lakes could settle into basins, and life could diversify within relatively stable boundaries. Geologists describe the continent as a patchwork of shields and basins, regions of uplift, interspersed with depressions where sediments have gathered for hundreds of millions of years. The Congo Basin, for instance, is a vast depression, surrounded by older highlands, while the Kalahari lies upon thick blankets of wind-borne sand that conceal ancient rocks below. Across this continent, the surface tells a story of time measured not in centuries or millennia, but in billions of years. Iron formations, banded and rust-red, reveal when oxygen first reacted with early seas. Basalt flows from long-cooled volcanoes mark periods when supercontinents assembled and then broke apart. To trace these patterns is to see the slow breathing of the planet itself, a rhythm that has set the tempo of life's evolution since the beginning. The assembly of Gondwana about 600 million years ago joined Africa with South America, India, Antarctica, and Australia in a massive southern supercontinent. Africa occupied a central position in this configuration, bordered by vast oceans and crossed by tectonic sutures where continental fragments met. When Gondwana eventually split, Africa retained much of its original core, drifting northward, but remaining geologically intact while others fragmented. Its long continuity meant that ecosystems could evolve atop enduring landscapes instead of being erased by shifting seas or sudden uplifts. Over tens of millions of years, erosion wore down mountain chains to gentle hills and plains, producing the wide-open topography that later defined its savannas. Yet this outward stillness hides slow internal movement. The African plate continues to ride upon convecting mantle currents, which stretch and crack its eastern edge. In the north, the collision of Africa with Eurasia pushed up the Atlas Mountains and closed the ancient Tethys Sea, reshaping global climate circulation. In the east, deep rifting began to pull the continent apart, forming the vast East African Rift System, a series of valleys, escarpments, and volcanic peaks that extend thousands of kilometers from the Red Sea to Mozambique. Though this rifting belongs more to the later chapters of the continent's story, its roots lie in the same deep mantle forces that have shaped Africa since its earliest formation. The presence of such an ancient stable landmass has profound consequences for evolution. Stability allows weathering to create soils over immense spans of time, fostering plant life that can persist even as climates oscillate. It enables drainage systems to carve permanent networks that sustain freshwater ecosystems. It allows ancient lineages of organisms, plants, fish, insects, and mammals to diversify within familiar terrain rather than being extinguished by repeated geological resets. Africa's vast interior basins, held stable by this old crust, became repositories of sediment that record millions of years of environmental change. In these layers, scientists now read the fine details of climate shifts and evolutionary transitions, tracing the slow interplay between Earth's surface and the lives it supports. Above this foundation, continental motion has altered latitude and exposure to sunlight, subtly shifting climate belts over time. During the Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras, Africa lay close to the South Pole, then drifted toward the equator, crossing zones of ice desert and lush vegetation. These movements altered rainfall patterns and ocean currents, establishing the alternating belts of arid and fertile zones that define the continent today. The Sahara, for example, was once a seabed and later a savanna before it became the desert we know. The high plateaus of southern and eastern Africa owe their elevation to ancient tectonic thickening preserved by the rigid cratonic roots below. These uplands play a key role in deflecting atmospheric flow, directing moisture inland from the oceans and helping sustain the alternating pattern of wet and dry seasons. The combination of elevation, geological variety, and climatic range gave Africa exceptional environmental diversity. Few other continents contain in one region both deserts extending thousands of kilometers and rainforests dense enough to create their own weather. This physical diversity shaped the future of life, providing countless ecological niches where adaptation could take root. Even before the rise of humans, Africa's stability nurtured repeated radiations of vertebrates, from early amphibians to dinosaurs and mammals, each finding opportunities within landscapes that endured long enough for evolutionary complexity to accumulate. The ancient rocks beneath modern savannas and forests still carry mineral clues to these deep histories. Zircons dated to over 3 billion years record the first solid crust. Greenstone belts preserve evidence of primordial oceans. These minerals tell of a planet settling into balance, cooling, and preparing to sustain complex life. When viewed on geological maps, Africa's structure appears as a mosaic of age and endurance, each province a layer of Earth's memory. From the South African Shield to the Nubian Domain, from the Congo Basin to the Saharan Metacraton, the continent is a record of slow resilience rather than sudden transformation. This endurance explains why sedimentary archives remain so complete, and why fossils of early hominins could be preserved in rift valleys and caves for millions of years. The landscape that greeted our distant ancestors was the product of billions of years of quiet preparation, a continent both stable and dynamic where tectonic calm coexisted with local turbulence. By the time the first primates appeared, Africa already possessed the physical complexity that would one day shape their evolution. Mountains, channeled rain valleys, trapped lakes, and volcanic soils nourished vegetation. Each of these features traces back to the deep geological frame established in the earliest eras. Thus, before climate, before species, before adaptation, there was land old steadfast and ready to bear the long experiment of life. The continent's ancient shape, formed by forces deep beneath and far beyond human comprehension, created the platform upon which evolution could begin its intricate work. The surface of Africa, though seemingly tranquil, is in perpetual conversation with the deep mantle below. Over tens of millions of years, slow convection currents have risen through Earth's interior, stretching and thinning the crust across a broad belt that runs from the Red Sea to Mozambique. This immense geological feature, known as the East African Rift System, is one of the most active continental rifts on the planet. It is here that Africa's stability gives way to motion, where the continent is literally pulling itself apart. The process is neither violent nor sudden, but unfolds with a patience that mirrors the rhythm of geological time. Valleys widen by millimeters each year, volcanic cones build and erode, and earthquakes occasionally remind inhabitants that deep forces are still at work beneath their feet. From satellite imagery, the rift appears as a chain of elongated basins bordered by steep escarpments and dotted with long, narrow lakes. Each lake occupies a graben, a block of crust that has sunk between diverging faults. Lakes Tanganyika and Malawi, among the deepest on Earth, rest within these troughs, filled by water and sediment accumulated over millions of years. The pattern of these basins traces the path of tectonic stress, dividing the continent into eastern and western branches. The eastern arm runs through Ethiopia and Kenya, where vast volcanic plateaus rise above the surrounding lowlands, while the western branch cuts through the heart of the continent, its valleys lush with forest and swamp. Volcanism accompanies this rifting, producing fertile soils, towering cones like Kilimanjaro, and vast lava fields that have periodically altered local climates. Such volcanism also releases gases that affect atmospheric composition, linking deep Earth processes to surface environments. Over long timescales, the rift has become a generator of diversity, its shifting landscapes isolating populations, redirecting rivers, and forming new ecological niches. Uplift along the rift margins elevated eastern Africa into a high plateau, altering rainfall patterns and temperature gradients. Moist air rising from the Indian Ocean cools as it climbs these escarpments, shedding rain on the seaward side, while creating drier rain shadows inland. This contrast between wet and arid zones intensified the mosaic of environments across the continent, a pattern that would later influence the distribution of species and the emergence of adaptable primates. Geological cores taken from lake beds reveal the history of this tectonic transformation in layers of silt and volcanic ash. Each layer records a pulse of change, periods of lake expansion and contraction, episodes of volcanic eruption, and intervals when dust settled thickly, marking times of drought. These sediments provide one of the most continuous environmental archives on Earth, capturing the interplay between tectonic's climate and life. The rifting did not occur in isolation. It is part of a broader pattern of continental rearrangement that began when Africa separated from South America about 130 million years ago. As the South Atlantic Ocean widened, new stresses built up within the African plate, creating weak zones that later evolved into rifts. Over time, the continent's interior became a landscape of faulted basins, tilted blocks, and uplifted plateaus. In Ethiopia, the crust thins dramatically and magma wells upward, creating geothermal systems and new oceanic crust beneath the Red Sea. If this process continues for millions more years, the Eastern Rift may eventually split Africa into two distinct landmasses, divided by a new ocean. Yet even now, the gradual opening has already changed surface conditions in profound ways. Rivers that once flowed across continuous plains have been diverted or trapped in lakes. Drainage patterns reversed, forming enclosed basins that alternately filled and dried as climates fluctuated. These hydrological shifts produced wetlands rich in life, but also vulnerable to change environments that would later serve as cradles for evolving hominins. The interplay between uplift and erosion also shaped biodiversity. High plateaus cooled as they rose, fostering montane forests that provided refuge for species during dry intervals. Valleys became conduits for migration linking regions that otherwise would have been isolated by climate. The mosaic of rift lakes, mountains and savannas acted as both bridge and barrier, encouraging populations to adapt locally while maintaining genetic exchange across distances. This dynamic geography, neither fully open nor fully closed, proved ideal for promoting evolutionary experimentation. In the Great Rift Valley, diversity thrives on instability. Geological uplift exposed mineral-rich soils that nourish grasses, attracting herbivores and their predators. Meanwhile, the rift's changing water levels forced organisms to adjust to alternating abundance and scarcity. In these alternating rhythms, natural selection found a laboratory. Each cycle of expansion and contraction reshaped the distribution of food, shelter, and competition, testing the flexibility of species that lived there. Over millions of years, this pattern would become a defining feature of African ecosystems and ultimately of human evolution itself. Beyond its physical grandeur, the rift system serves as a bridge between the deep past and the living present. Modern geothermal vents, hot springs, and volcanic fields echo processes that have been active for tens of millions of years. These features remind observers that the surface of Africa, though ancient, is never static. It is continuously renewed, and this renewal ensures the persistence of environmental gradients that sustain biodiversity. The geological forces that built the rift also connected Africa to global systems. Uplift of the eastern highlands altered the flow of the Nile, linking tropical rainfall to the Mediterranean. Volcanic emissions influenced global carbon cycles, affecting temperatures far beyond the continent. The birth of basins and highlands changed how winds move moisture across the equator, contributing to the periodic shifts of the African monsoon. In this way, local tectonics became a driver of planetary climate patterns, embedding Africa within Earth's global engine. The long-term consequence of this motion is an extraordinary range of altitudes and habitats, from sea-level plains to peaks over 5,000 meters high. This elevation diversity translates directly into temperature and rainfall diversity, compressing within a single region the environmental contrasts that on other continents are separated by thousands of kilometers. Where the rift valleys open into basins, deep lakes regulate local climate, buffering temperature extremes and supporting dense vegetation even in drier times. When the lakes shrink, exposed sediments create dusty plains that alter atmospheric reflectivity and influence monsoon strength. These feedbacks link geology, hydrology, and climate in a single continuous system that has persisted for millions of years. In the grand sweep of planetary evolution, the East African Rift stands as both a symptom and a cause of change, a visible trace of Earth's restless interior, and an engine that continually reshapes the surface. Through its slow widening, it has turned a single stable plateau into a patchwork of habitats, each with its own rhythm of flood and drought, abundance and scarcity. This instability, while destructive in one sense, has been profoundly creative in another. It forced life to adapt, diversify and innovate. The same processes that crack the continent also created the stage for the emergence of species capable of thought and reflection. Africa's motion, measured in millimeters per year, would ultimately set in motion an evolutionary story that unfolds in leaps of mind and culture. Beneath the still air of the savannas, the earth continues to move, and that movement remains the quiet architect of life's unfolding on this ancient land. The rhythm of life in Africa has always been governed by the movement of air and water, the invisible currents that link ocean to continent and sky to soil. Above the Great Plateau, the atmosphere pulses with seasonal cycles of moisture and heat, a dynamic system driven by solar energy and the turning of the planet. To understand why evolution took root here, one must see how climate itself became a creative force. Africa sits astride the equator, exposed to the full symmetry of Earth's tilt and orbit. The continent spans both hemispheres from the Mediterranean coast to the meeting of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans at the southern tip. This position gives it the widest range of latitudes crossed by any single landmass dominated by tropical conditions. As a result, Africa receives more consistent solar radiation than any other continent. The equatorial sun warms the land unevenly, drawing air upward to form towering convective storms. Moisture from the oceans condenses into clouds that drift inland, releasing seasonal rains that feed rivers and lakes. These vast circulations form the heartbeat of the monsoon systems that define Africa's climate. The Intertropical Convergence Zone, a moving belt of low pressure, where northern and southern air masses meet, shifts north and south, with the seasons carrying rainfall in its wake. Each year its passage brings wet months and dry months, in repeating rhythm nurturing vegetation that grows, withers, and returns in endless cycles. Over tens of thousands of years, these oscillations have been amplified by subtle changes in Earth's orbit. The planet's path around the Sun is not constant. It wobbles, tilts, and stretches in patterns known as Milankovitch cycles. These cycles alter the distribution of sunlight across the globe, modulating the strength of monsoons and the spread of deserts. When orbital conditions favour stronger summer heating in the northern hemisphere, the African monsoon intensifies, drawing moist air far inland. Grasslands expand, lakes fill, and rivers connect across basins. When the pattern reverses, the continent dries, vegetation retreats, and dust drifts from barren plains. These alternating phases of abundance and scarcity have repeated countless times through the Quaternary period, reshaping the environments where early humans evolved. Evidence of these fluctuations lies preserved in sediments and cave formations across the continent, cores extracted from Lake Malawi, Lake Tanganyika, and the Gulf of Aden reveal rhythmic layers of mud and dust, corresponding to wet and dry periods. Within these layers, the chemical signatures of oxygen isotopes trace the evaporation and refilling of lakes, a record of rainfall stretching back millions of years. The Sahara Desert today, a vast expanse of sand, has alternated between arid emptiness and green savanna more than once. Fossilized river channels and pollen grains buried beneath dunes show that during certain orbital alignments, monsoon rains reached deep into the heart of the desert, transforming it into a corridor of life that linked sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. The shifting strength of these monsoons governed the distribution of vegetation, and vegetation in turn fed back into the climate system. Forests and grasslands differ in how they absorb sunlight and release moisture, so as landscapes expanded or contracted, they altered local temperature and humidity, reinforcing the cycles of change. Even small variations in sea surface temperature could ripple across the continent, amplifying rainfall in one region, while deepening drought in another. The Indian Ocean's currents and the Atlantic's trade winds together create contrasting zones of aridity and fertility. The cold Benguela current along the southwest coast chills the air, suppressing rainfall and giving rise to deserts like the Namib. The warm Agulhas current along the east coast brings humidity and storms, feeding the lush coastal forests of Mozambique and Tanzania. Farther north, the Atlantic's equatorial currents interact with the continent's shape to generate the Gulf of Guinea's heavy rains, sustaining the West African forests. Each of these systems responds to global ocean temperatures, which fluctuate in tandem with glacial and interglacial periods. During ice ages, sea levels fall and coastlines stretch outward, exposing continental shelves and altering ocean circulation. These shifts modify the transport of heat and moisture toward Africa, changing not only the amount of rainfall, but its timing and distribution. The consequence is a continent in perpetual climatic motion, where no equilibrium lasts long enough for species to rest in comfort. Africa's climate engine does not merely oscillate in predictable rhythm. It pulses irregularly with intervals of stability punctuated by abrupt transitions. Dust records from ocean sediments west of the continent show spikes corresponding to sudden droughts events that may have lasted centuries yet profoundly reshaped ecosystems. For early humans, such variability was not an occasional challenge but a constant companion. The ability to survive meant the ability to adapt to move when rivers dried, to exploit new food sources when old ones vanished, and to endure temperature swings that could transform grasslands into scrub and back again within a few generations. Climate also shaped the geography of resources. In humid phases, lakes connected across rift basins, forming freshwater corridors that linked otherwise isolated populations. During dry phases, these connections broke isolating groups in separate refuges. This alternation between connection and separation played a major role in genetic diversification, allowing populations to drift and adapt locally before being reunited when conditions changed. In this sense, climate variability acted as both sculptor and weaver, carving boundaries and then stitching them together again. Over geological timescales, atmospheric dust carried by African winds influenced distant regions as well. Dust from the Sahara fertilizes the Amazon rainforest across the Atlantic, demonstrating that the continent's climate has global reach. The same winds that buried ancient river valleys also helped seed forests half a world away. Africa thus functions not only as a recipient of planetary forces, but as a driver of them, feeding nutrients and aerosols into global systems that sustain life elsewhere. This interconnectedness underscores the scale at which evolution operates. No ecosystem is truly isolated from the rhythms of the planet's air and water. The ongoing interaction between land and atmosphere has also left subtle fingerprints on human prehistory. Archaeological sites show bursts of activity corresponding to wetter intervals, when resources were abundant and settlements more stable. During prolonged droughts, artifacts thin out, suggesting migration or population decline. Each climatic swing left traces in stone tools, hearths and bones, recording not only the passage of time, but the changing face of adaptation. The interplay between ocean currents, monsoons, and orbital cycles created an environment where uncertainty was the only constant, and this uncertainty became the crucible of flexibility. Africa's climate engine, complex and restless, forged the conditions that would later reward ingenuity and resilience. The continent's atmospheric systems, driven by sunlight rotation and ocean exchange, never allowed complacency. In their unending alternation of wet and dry, they sculpted landscapes of challenge and opportunity, shaping the stage on which evolution's next act would unfold. Across Africa, the climate has never remained still for long. Over the span of millions of years, its skies, rivers, and vegetation have shifted in response to the planet's subtle tilts, the breathing of the oceans and the slow rearrangement of continents. This endless variation, known as climate variability, became one of the most powerful engines of evolution on Earth. In Africa, change was not rare or catastrophic. It was rhythmic, recurrent, and often unpredictable. The continents farther north or south endured long freezes or uniform climates, but Africa's position near the equator placed it at the intersection of every atmospheric pulse. As the planet's orbit wobbled and its axis leaned by a few degrees more or less, rainfall belts drifted thousands of kilometers. Where forests once stood, grasslands appeared. Where lakes once sparkled, salt flats spread. The same regions that teemed with life in one epoch could turn barren in the next. This constant reshuffling created a pattern of environmental boom and bust that left its mark on every living thing from the roots of plants to the brains of primates. Geological records tell this story in quiet detail. Deep-sea cores off the coast of West Africa capture alternating layers of dark carbon-rich sediment, laid down during humid phases and pale, dusty layers from arid intervals. Each shift corresponds to the waxing and waning of the African monsoon tied to orbital cycles lasting 20 to 100,000 years. Within these layers lie signals of ancient vegetation pollen grains from tropical forests, grass fragments, and charcoal from fires that swept through drying savannas. These traces reveal a continent in constant transition, one that never allowed species to settle into permanent equilibrium. During wet periods, rivers braided across floodplains and lakes overflowed, linking distant basins into vast inland seas. Fish and aquatic plants spread between valleys and forests advanced into areas now covered by desert. When the rains retreated, the same waterways shrank to isolated pools, cutting off populations and forcing adaptation or extinction. Fossilized shorelines in the East African Rift mark these swings, where ancient lake levels rose hundreds of meters higher than today, before evaporating into dust. Each fluctuation left behind bands of silt and tufa, silent witnesses to water's retreat and return. Such cycles repeated so often that they became the background rhythm of evolution itself. Life in Africa learned to move with these pulses rather than against them. Herbivores followed the shifting edge of rainfall. Predators trailed their prey, and vegetation evolved rapid recovery strategies after drought. Even microbial communities in ancient lakes responded to salinity changes with bursts of diversification. The instability that could destroy ecosystems elsewhere became in Africa the source of ecological creativity. Climate variability acted not merely as a stress, but as a force of innovation. When habitats changed, species either adapted quickly or disappeared. Those that survived passed on the flexibility needed to endure the next swing. In this way, instability favored adaptability, a trait that would later define the human lineage. The archaeological record reflects this pattern of adjustment. In regions where alternating wet and dry cycles were most intense, such as the East African Rift, the fossil record shows a succession of hominin species appearing flourishing and fading in tandem with climatic oscillations. Sediments from sites like Olduvai Gorge preserve alternating layers of volcanic ash and lake mud, each representing a different world, one green and lush, another dry and dusty. Stone tools found between these layers record how early humans shifted strategies, with the landscape adopting new materials when rivers receded, broadening diets when forests retreated. The pattern suggests that environmental unpredictability did not hinder progress. It fostered it. Every climatic upheaval presented new problems to solve, and in solving them, species grew more versatile. Africa's position between two great oceans amplified this variability. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans respond differently to global temperature shifts, creating competing influences on the continent's rainfall. When the Indian Ocean warms, moisture flows inland across East Africa. When the Atlantic dominates, the western tropics bloom. These alternating oceanic phases can oppose one another, producing complex patchworks of drought and abundance that vary across regions. In one part of the continent, rivers flood and vegetation thrives, while 1,000 kilometers away the land withers under heat and dust. Such contrasts often existed simultaneously, ensuring that at least some refuges remained habitable even in the harshest times. This unevenness preserved continuity of life and provided reservoirs of diversity from which new species could later emerge. The fossil pollen record from the Congo Basin shows that even during major droughts, fragments of rainforest survived in sheltered valleys, serving as seed banks for re-expansion when humidity returned. Similarly, the Ethiopian highlands retained moist enclaves where unique species evolved in isolation, later mingling with lowland forms as conditions improved. These refugia, small pockets of stability within a restless system, were critical to maintaining Africa's extraordinary biodiversity. They also shaped the genetic structure of early human populations, encouraging separation and reconnection in repeating cycles that mirrored the beat of climate change. The pulse of variability reached its greatest amplitude during the last few million years, when global ice ages intensified. Although glaciers never covered most of Africa, the indirect effects were immense. Ice sheets in the north trapped water and cooled the atmosphere, weakening monsoons and expanding deserts. When the ice melted, rainfall surged back, turning arid basins into freshwater lakes. These oscillations, occurring roughly every 100,000 years, reshaped ecosystems across the continent. Each pulse of aridity tested resilience, while each humid rebound offered opportunity. In some intervals, entire corridors of migration opened, linking the interior to the coast and the savannas to the forests. In others, those corridors closed, isolating populations for tens of thousands of years. Through it all, the pattern remained cyclical destruction, followed by renewal, scarcity, followed by abundance. For the ancestors of modern humans, this environment demanded a kind of cognitive flexibility unmatched elsewhere. To live through repeated droughts, early communities had to remember where water persisted, to recognize seasonal signals, and to anticipate shifts in vegetation and prey. Over generations, such environmental pressure rewarded planning and social cooperation traits that would later become hallmarks of our species. Yet the same forces that spurred adaptation also left scars. Each major drying phase drove extinctions among less mobile species, pruning ecosystems and resetting the evolutionary stage. The survivors carried the imprint of resilience, forming the roots of lineages that still inhabit the continent today. Even now, Africa's landscapes bear the signature of that ancient rhythm. The alternating belts of green and desert visible from orbit trace the zones once governed by shifting rainfall. The dust that drifts from the Sahara to the Atlantic each year is a modern echo of cycles that have persisted for millions of years. In this perpetual flux, life learned endurance not by resisting change but by inhabiting it. The pulse of variability shaped Africa into a continent of motion rivers, changing course animals, migrating genes, mixing, and species evolving under a sky that never settled. The land's greatest constant was its instability, and in that instability lay the quiet strength that made Africa the birthplace of adaptation. Across Africa's immense surface, the shifting climate, the restless tectonic plates, and the steady carving of rivers combined to create a landscape unlike any other on Earth, a continent of mosaics. Instead of broad uniform biomes stretching unbroken for thousands of kilometers, Africa became a patchwork of environments, wetlands beside deserts, grasslands beside forests, cool uplands shadowing dry plains. Each zone graded into the next through narrow corridors and steep transitions, forming a living tapestry of contrasts. This mosaic character defined not only the land but the rhythm of its life, setting the stage for the emergence of species that could navigate between worlds rather than belong to only one. The making of these mosaics began with water. The rift lakes of East Africa, the Congo's looping river systems, and the shallow floodplains of the Niger and Okavango formed dynamic cores around which vegetation assembled and reorganized. In times of heavy rainfall, these wetlands expanded, linking distant basins into continuous aquatic networks that allowed animals and plants to spread across broad regions. When climates dried, the networks fractured into isolated lakes and marshes, stranding populations and creating microhabitats of exceptional diversity. Around these water bodies, belts of lush vegetation flourished, gallery forests, tracing the banks, grasslands fanning outward into open plains, then shrublands fading into the arid horizon. Each belt responded differently to rainfall, soil, and elevation, so no single region remained constant for long. A rise in temperature could shift the balance, turning forest to savanna within centuries. These fluctuations generated boundaries that moved across the landscape like slow waves, testing the adaptability of every species that lived along their edges. In the great interior basins, particularly those of the Congo and Kalahari, alternating periods of sedimentation and erosion produced rolling plains punctuated by wetlands and dunes. Such varied topography supported multiple microclimates, from the humid lowland rainforest to the dry miombo woodland and the open grassland fringes. The proximity of these habitats meant that species rarely existed in isolation. Elephants moved from forest to grassland to find fruit or graze. Antelopes browsed the edges of the woodlands before retreating to shade. Primates exploited both trees and open ground. The mosaic of opportunities encouraged mobility, broad diets, and behavioral plasticity. Even plants mirrored this adaptability with root systems and leaf structures tuned to both flood and drought. Diversity became not just a feature, but a rule of survival. In East Africa, where tectonic uplift created high plateaus beside low rift valleys, the juxtaposition of climates was particularly dramatic. Highland slopes supported cool montane forests, while nearby basins endured intense heat and sparse rainfall. Rivers descending from the uplands delivered mineral-rich sediments that nourished floodplains below, forming fertile belts that changed character with every flood. Over time, this environmental layering encouraged evolutionary branching. Populations of the same species adapted to differing conditions only kilometers apart, and when wetter periods reconnected, the region's interbreeding introduced new genetic combinations. This constant mixing and separation, driven by mosaic geography, generated extraordinary biodiversity. The fossil record reflects this fine-grained pattern. Layers in the Homo and Turkana basins preserve faunal remains from adjacent but distinct habitats, showing how grass-eating grazers, leaf-browsing herbivores, and omnivorous species coexisted within overlapping ranges. Such ecological overlap created both opportunity and tension competition, pushed animals to specialize while variability forced them to remain flexible. The outcome was an environment that rewarded innovation, where the difference between survival and extinction often depended on an organism's ability to exploit marginal zones. The mosaic structure also shaped predator-prey dynamics. Lions, hyenas, and leopards roamed between open plains and wooded margins following migrating herds. Crocodiles and hippos inhabited the transition between land and water, feeding on life from both realms. These interfaces, shorelines, forest edges, and seasonal wetlands, were places of abundance and danger, rich in resources, but requiring constant alertness. For early hominins, such boundary zones offered both challenge and opportunity. The alternating availability of fruits, roots, small game, and aquatic resources demanded mobility and awareness of multiple ecosystems. Unlike in stable forests or uniform grasslands, success in a mosaic environment meant learning the signals of each habitat and moving fluidly among them. This ecological fluidity would later become one of the defining traits of human evolution. The creation of mosaics was also influenced by Africa's exceptional range of elevations. From the Ethiopian highlands to the Drakensberg Mountains, from the rift escarpments to the coastal plains, altitude produced steep gradients of temperature and rainfall over short distances. Such gradients allowed species to shift vertically in response to climate change rather than migrate across entire continents. When temperatures cooled, forests descended the slopes. When they warmed, the vegetation climbed again. This vertical motion preserved continuity of ecosystems even as global climate swung, maintaining refugees for life through countless transitions. The result was a continent where evolutionary experiments could proceed without complete resets. Coastal regions added yet another dimension. Along the eastern and southern shores, tidal flats, estuaries and mangroves formed rich transitional environments where land met sea. Seasonal upwelling of nutrient-rich waters sustained abundant marine life, attracting birds and mammals to the interface between salt and fresh water. Inland desert margins like those of the Namib and Sahara supported oases that punctuated arid expanses, each functioning as a microcosm of diversity. Everywhere contrast was the rule: humidity beside aridity, elevation beside depression, fertility beside desolation. This spatial variety made Africa less vulnerable to total collapse during extreme events. When drought struck the interior, wetter refugees remained near coasts or mountains. When floods spread through the lowlands, dry highlands persisted above. The landscape's heterogeneity served as an insurance system for life, ensuring that at least some habitats were always viable. Over millions of years, this resilience allowed complex ecosystems to persist through upheavals that extinguished species elsewhere. The mosaic pattern also played a key role in maintaining Africa's role as the cradle of large mammals. Because environments were continuously reconfigured but rarely destroyed, wholesale evolutionary lineages could radiate into new niches while retaining connections to ancestral ones. Elephants, rhinoceroses, and antelopes diversified in step with shifting vegetation, producing a spectrum of forms adapted to browsing, grazing, and mixed feeding. The coexistence of so many closely related species within small areas was possible only because of the continent's fine-grained environmental diversity. This same diversity offered a testing ground for behavioral flexibility among primates. From the rainforests of Central Africa to the open acacia savannas, monkeys and apes exploited a variety of foods, nesting sites, and social strategies. Some climbed high to escape predators, others foraged on the ground, and a few learned to use stones or branches as tools. Each adaptation represented a response to the changing balance of the mosaic, an early rehearsal for the cognitive and physical versatility that would define the human lineage. The birth of these mosaics transformed Africa from a passive backdrop into an active participant in evolution. The continent's patchwork of habitats acted as a vast ecological engine, generating novelty through contrast and continuity through variation. Where other continents offered stability, Africa offered diversity and motion. It was this dynamic complexity, this constant blending of wet and dry, high and low, fertile and barren, that nurtured the ancestors of humanity. Within the shifting pattern of its landscapes lay the raw material for adaptation, creativity, and survival, the elements from which the next great chapter of evolution would rise. Through much of the late Cenozoic, Africa became a stage filled with immense creatures, each finely tuned to the rhythms of its landscapes. The continent's stability, combined with its patchwork of habitats, allowed lineages to persist and diversify on a scale unmatched elsewhere. Elephants, rhinoceroses, hippos, giraffes, antelopes, zebras, and countless other mammals coexisted with formidable predators, lions, leopards, saber-toothed cats, hyenas and crocodiles, forming an intricate web of life that balanced power and vulnerability. This abundance did not arise by chance. It was shaped by the same climatic variability and environmental mosaics that drove evolutionary experimentation. The great herbivores evolved as specialists in consuming vegetation that changed from season to season and region to region. Some grazed the open grasslands that spread during cooler, drier intervals. Others browsed shrubs and trees during wetter times when forests advanced. The diversity of feeding strategies allowed dozens of large species to share the same landscapes, their distributions overlapping without collapsing into direct competition. Each species occupied a slightly different niche, feeding at different heights, choosing different plants, migrating along different paths. The savanna, seemingly uniform from afar, was in reality a complex web of interlocking territories and foraging zones. The constant motion of these animals shaped the land as much as it shaped them. Herds trampled paths that guided runoff, spreading seeds and nutrients. Their dung fertilized soils and sustained invertebrates, which in turn nourished birds and reptiles. Predators followed the migrations, and scavengers followed the predators, recycling remains back into the ground. Africa's ecosystems became self-sustaining cycles of energy, transfer each link dependent on countless others. The coexistence of such giants required both space and renewal. Fire driven by seasonal lightning played a critical role in maintaining this balance. When dry grasses ignited, flames cleared dead vegetation and returned minerals to the soil, ensuring that young shoots would sprout with the rains. Many species evolved to take advantage of this rhythm. Grazers moved into burned areas to feed on tender regrowth. Birds followed the fires to catch insects fleeing the smoke. The mosaic of recently burned and unburned patches added another layer of diversity to an already varied landscape. This dynamic prevented forest from encroaching completely upon the plains and sustained the open environments that favoured large mobile animals. Within this living laboratory, predation exerted constant evolutionary pressure. Lions formed cooperative prides to tackle massive herbivores. Cheetahs developed speed and agility for solitary hunts. Hyenas perfected endurance and teamwork to exhaust prey across long distances. Each adaptation triggered counter-responses among the hunted, alertness herding camouflage and sheer physical strength. The arms race between predator and prey intensified intelligence and social behavior, fostering communication through calls, gestures, and scent. Among primates, vigilance and coordination became essential to survival, encouraging the early development of group awareness that would later characterize the human lineage. Africa's long isolation ensured that these communities evolved with minimal external disturbance. When ice ages gripped the northern continents, Africa remained mostly free of glaciers, its ecosystems shifting in composition rather than disappearing entirely. This continuity allowed long evolutionary experiments to unfold without interruption. Ancient lineages like elephants, whose ancestors had roamed the planet since the Miocene, refined their anatomy and behavior in response to subtle ecological pressures. Some developed longer trunks and larger ears for thermoregulation in open plains. Others retained forest-adapted forms with smaller bodies and straighter tusks. Such diversification occurred repeatedly, producing parallel branches of evolution within single genera. Similar patterns appeared among antelopes, whose varieties filled every imaginable ecological niche, from desert specialists to swamp dwellers. The presence of so many coexisting species produced intense competition, yet it also maintained equilibrium. Predators could not exhaust their prey, and prey could not overgraze their environment. The feedbacks were tight, regulated by climate cycles that alternately favoured one group over another. During wetter periods, browsers thrived on leafy vegetation. During drier times, grazers dominated the expanding grasslands. These alternations ensured that neither community gained permanent supremacy. Fossil evidence from sites such as Laetoli Olduvai and the Turkana Basin captures these transitions layer by layer, recording how faunal turnovers mirrored shifts in vegetation and climate. The assemblages change not abruptly but gradually, each stratum showing adjustments rather than replacements, a continuity of life negotiating with time. The abundance of large fauna also influenced the structure of vegetation. Elephants pushed down trees, opening clearings that maintained savannas. Hippos carved river channels and kept wetlands alive. Grazing herds prevented woody encroachment. Without such disturbances, much of Africa might have reverted to closed forest, limiting the diversity of habitats. The giants thus acted as ecosystem engineers, reshaping their surroundings in ways that preserved variety. Their presence reinforced the mosaic principle. Each environment depended on the activity of species that linked it to its neighbours. In this world of giants, smaller creatures thrived as well. Birds followed herds to feed on disturbed insects. Amphibians multiplied in ephemeral pools left by hoofprints. Insects adapted to specific dung or carrion sources, their life cycles synchronized with the movements of larger animals. Every level of the food web echoed the rhythms of migration and seasonality. The richness of life became not a static abundance, but a constant motion of energy through countless bodies. The scale of Africa's ecological complexity made it uniquely resilient to disturbance. Droughts might empty lakes and drive migrations, yet within a few years returning rains restored balance. When local extinctions occurred, recolonization soon followed from adjacent habitats. This persistence through flux became the defining characteristic of African ecosystems and the backdrop against which the human story would unfold. For early hominins, the presence of large mammals was both opportunity and constraint. Carcasses left by predators provided meat and marrow-concentrated sources of energy that could be accessed without the risk of hunting. At the same time, those predators represented a constant threat, shaping the behavior, vigilance, and cooperation of small primate groups. Surviving in a landscape shared with such formidable competitors demanded awareness planning and the ability to exploit what others left behind. These pressures likely honed the sensory and cognitive capacities of our ancestors, who learned to read the movements of herds, anticipate predator behavior, and scavenge efficiently. The relationship between early humans and the great fauna was not one of dominance but of coexistence within shared systems of scarcity and renewal. Africa's giant mammals, sustained by the continent's geological and climatic continuity, thus formed the biological environment that nurtured human evolution. They influenced the distribution of resources, the shape of vegetation, and the dynamics of fear and opportunity. Even after many of these species vanished elsewhere, Africa remained a refuge for them because its ecosystems had evolved in their presence and adapted to their impact. The persistence of megafauna through repeated climatic oscillations speaks to the continent's ecological balance, a balance achieved through movement rather than stability, through adaptation rather than stasis. The savannas, forests, and wetlands of Africa were arenas of constant negotiation between abundance and limitation, cooperation, and conflict, continuity, and change. Within that equilibrium, new possibilities emerged. Among the many species navigating these intertwined lives, one lineage of upright apes began to take its first uncertain steps into open space, learning to survive not through strength or speed, but through understanding. The world of giants had made the stage ready for minds that would one day look back and study the land that shaped them. In the landscapes carved by rifts, lakes, and shifting grasslands, a new form of life began to move upright. The first hominins, early members of the human branch, appeared within the dynamic settings of Africa's late Miocene and early Pliocene epochs, roughly between 7 and 4 million years ago. Their emergence was not sudden, but gradual, a series of adjustments to an ever-changing world. The mosaic of forests and open habitats encouraged experimentation in posture, diet, and mobility. Standing upright was not an invention but a solution, a way to see above tall grasses, to travel efficiently between patches of shade, and to carry food or infants across uncertain terrain. The skeletons of species such as Sahelanthropus orerin and Ardipithecus preserve this transition. Pelvises reshaped for balanced spines, curved to support an upright stance, toes aligned for forward motion rather than grasping branches. These early bipeds lived in environments that were neither dense forest nor open savanna, but mixtures of both. The ability to navigate multiple habitats was an evolutionary advantage, and Africa's constant environmental flux made such versatility essential. Fossilized footprints at Letoli in Tanzania, preserved in volcanic ash about 3.5 million years old, show two individuals walking side by side on soft ground. Their stride, their heel-to-toe motion, their balance, all reveal that upright walking was already well established. Yet bipedalism was only one adaptation among many. These early hominins retained the long arms and curved fingers of climbers, moving with ease between trees and ground. They inhabited a world filled with predators, and the safety of the canopy remained vital. Their small canine teeth suggest that aggression was less important than cooperation and awareness. As the rift valleys deepened and climates swung between wet and dry populations, became fragmented, isolated by lakes, or separated by expanding savannas. In each refuge, evolution took a slightly different path. Australopithecus species arose in eastern and southern Africa, their fossils found from Hadar in Ethiopia to Sterkfontein in South Africa. They walked upright, used simple tools of stone or bone, and lived in groups that relied on social cohesion. Their diets were diverse roots, tubers, fruits, and perhaps the occasional carcass scavenged from larger predators. The ability to exploit multiple food sources buffered them against environmental uncertainty. Teeth and jaws became strong, capable of grinding tough plant matter when softer foods disappeared. Over time, some lineages developed larger bodies and smaller faces, while others specialized further. Their massive jaws adapted for chewing fibrous vegetation. The diversity of forms reflected the diversity of environments. Each shift in rainfall and vegetation left its imprint on anatomy and behavior. The East African rift served as both laboratory and archive for these experiments, preserving fossils in its sediments layer by layer. Each stratum marks a different world, ancient lake beds filled with reeds, volcanic plains crossed by rivers, floodplains where bones accumulated under shifting sediments. The pattern of discovery mirrors the pattern of the land itself, fragmented, varied, but continuous in time. As the Pliocene gave way to the Pleistocene around 2.5 million years ago, the pace of environmental change accelerated. Glacial cycles began to dominate the global climate, and Africa's wet-dry rhythm became more pronounced. Grasslands expanded across broad regions, forests retreated into valleys and highlands, and with these transformations came new challenges. It was within this setting that the first members of the genus Homo emerged. They were distinguished not by size or strength, but by subtle shifts in brain organization and behavior. The earlier species Homo habilis retained many Australopithecine features, but showed evidence of tool-making. In riverbeds near Olduvai Gorge, sharp-edged flakes of stone appear beside bones marked with cut lines. These tools, simple yet deliberate, signalled a new relationship between mind and material. For the first time, an animal used the landscape not merely as a backdrop, but as a resource to be shaped. Stone tools expanded dietary range, allowing access to marrow and meat that teeth alone could not reach. This new flexibility provided resilience against the fluctuations of climate. Hominins could now adapt behaviorally rather than anatomically adjusting diet and strategy without waiting for the slow march of genetic change. The emergence of tool use also altered social life. Cooperation became more complex as sharing and learning replaced pure instinct. The ability to imitate and teach conferred advantages on groups that could maintain traditions through generations. These early technologies were not inventions in isolation, but cumulative responses to Africa's unstable environments. When lakes dried or vegetation shifted, new raw materials became available, and methods of working stone evolved in tandem. The continent itself provided the canvas volcanic glass basalt and quartzite from rift escarpments, river pebbles worn smooth by water, hard limestone in upland basins. Each tool carries the signature of a mind adapting to its surroundings. While the development of technology marked a profound change, other pressures continue to shape the body. Bipedalism freed the hands, but it also demanded energy efficiency. The long legs and spring-like tendons of later hominins allowed them to cover vast distances with minimal effort. Persistence hunting, chasing prey until it overheated, may have emerged in this context, combining endurance planning and cooperation. Such strategies required not only physical stamina, but communication and timing. The open landscapes of Africa rewarded those who could work together, anticipate and share the fruits of success. In this way, the continent's geography and climate directly sculpted the evolution of both body and mind. As habitats fragmented and reconnected, populations of early Homo spread across regions, sometimes mixing, sometimes diverging. Fossils from sites like Kubifora, Sterkfontein and Drumolen show overlapping traits that blur the boundaries between species. Rather than a single line of descent, the human lineage resembles a braided stream, multiple branches flowing through time, merging and dividing as conditions changed. Africa's vastness ensured that no single environment or adaptation could dominate for long. Diversity became the norm and flexibility the ultimate strategy. The combination of tectonic complexity, climatic variability, and faunal richness created an environment that demanded ingenuity. Each change in vegetation or rainfall reshaped the distribution of food and shelter, forcing early humans to anticipate and remember. Over generations, selection favored those who could plan and cooperate, qualities rooted in the challenges of living among giants and navigating a landscape of constant change. By the end of this long interval, around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus emerged with a larger brain, a more efficient stride, and a toolkit refined for precision and durability. These developments did not occur suddenly or in isolation. They were the cumulative result of millions of years of adaptation to Africa's restless geography. The first hominins had walked upright into an unpredictable world, and by doing so began a journey that would eventually circle the entire planet. Yet the path was not outward but inward toward the evolution of cognition, communication, and community that had its roots in the soils, rivers, and open horizons of Africa itself. Among the volcanic plains and river valleys of East Africa, the rhythmic striking of stone upon stone marked the dawn of a new kind of intelligence. Around 2.5 million years ago, early members of the genus Homo began to shape their surroundings, deliberately crafting tools that extended the reach of their bodies and the memory of their minds. The act of napping, splitting one rock with another to create a sharp edge, was more than a gesture of necessity. It represented the emergence of planning foresight and shared knowledge. Every flake detached from a core carried within it a decision where to strike, how to angle, what material to choose. The landscapes that had once been sculpted only by wind and water now bore the imprint of thought. The Oldowan tools among the earliest known were simple but revolutionary rough-edged flakes used to slice meat, scrape hides, or cut roots. Yet their simplicity hides remarkable skill. The toolmakers selected hard stones such as basalt chert or quartzite, carried them from their sources and struck them with precision. These actions demanded not only strength and coordination, but mental mapping of the resources scattered across the landscape. In places like Olduvai Gorge and the Omo Valley, these early technologies appear alongside animal bones bearing cut marks, clear evidence that their makers were scavenging carcasses left by predators. Access to meat and marrow provided dense nutrition that fueled brain growth linking culture and biology in a feedback loop that would shape the trajectory of the species. The next great innovation, the Acheulean hand axe, appeared about 1.5 million years ago. Its symmetry and refinement reveal a mind capable of abstraction. To carve a teardrop-shaped tool from stone required the ability to imagine the final form hidden within the raw material. Each blow removed flakes in a planned sequence, balancing shape and function. The hand axe was not limited to a single task. It was a versatile extension of the body, equally suited to cutting, digging, or shaping wood. The repetition of this design across vast distances and time periods from Kenya to Morocco, from Ethiopia to South Africa, speaks to a shared understanding passed between generations. Teaching imitation and memory became essential mechanisms of survival. This transmission of knowledge transformed evolution itself, shifting the pace of adaptation from biological inheritance to cultural learning. Africa's dynamic environments amplified the importance of these abilities. As climates fluctuated, habitats expanded and contracted, demanding constant innovation. Toolmaking allowed humans to adjust rapidly to new challenges without waiting for anatomy to catch up. When lakes dried and resources dwindled, sharper blades and more efficient techniques compensated for scarcity. When forests retreated and open savannas spread, tools enabled access to new kinds of food bones, to crack tubers, to dig hides to prepare. The Oldowan and Acheulean industries thus record not only technological progress, but also resilience against environmental instability. The distribution of stone tools across the continent mirrors the flow of water and the rise of land. Sites cluster near ancient lakes, riverbanks, and volcanic outcrops, where raw materials and prey converged. Each layer of sediment preserves a snapshot of behavior, flakes scattered around a butchering site hearths, marked by ash and charcoal bones broken for marrow. These traces form an archaeological chorus that speaks of planning, cooperation, and shared purpose. The emergence of controlled fire, perhaps by 800,000 years ago, added another dimension to this growing mastery. Fire provided warmth during cold nights, protection from predators, and a means to cook food, softening fibers and releasing nutrients that made digestion easier. Cooking reduced the energy required to process food, freeing resources for the expanding brain. The glow of campfires also extended the day, creating new social spaces where communication could evolve. In these gatherings, gestures and sounds may have gained meaning, laying the groundwork for language. Each innovation in technology thus intertwined with changes in anatomy and behavior. As stone tools became more complex, the human hand adapted for precision grip, with a strengthened thumb and sensitive fingertips. The brain regions associated with coordination and planning expanded, and social bonds grew deeper as individuals depended on shared knowledge. The creation of tools, once a response to necessity, became a form of expression, a demonstration of understanding between minds. The Herculean tradition endured for more than 1,000,000 years, spanning vast climatic shifts. During humid phases, humans lived near rivers and lakes, hunting and gathering in lush surroundings. During dry intervals, they retreated to refuges, carrying their knowledge with them. The continuity of tool types across these transitions indicates that culture provided stability where the environment did not. While species came and went, the ideas embedded in stone persisted, handed from one generation to the next. This persistence marks a profound shift in evolution survival, now depended not only on genes, but on the transmission of learned behavior. Africa's geological variety supplied the raw materials for these technological revolutions. Volcanic fields yielded obsidian sharp enough to cut skin with a touch. River gravels provided quartz and flint. Desert margins offered nodules of jasper and chalcedony. The landscape itself became an archive of human innovation. As populations moved across regions, they carried not just tools, but the memory of how to make them. Archaeological finds show the same design appearing thousands of kilometers apart, evidence of networks of knowledge that prefigured the later dispersals of our species. These connections imply communication beyond simple mimicry, a capacity for teaching, and the recognition of shared purpose. The expansion of tool culture coincided with the growth of social complexity. Cooperation in hunting and gathering required coordination, division of tasks, and planning. Sites containing remains of large animals such as elephants or hippopotamuses suggest organized effort far beyond the capacity of solitary individuals. The success of such ventures depended on anticipating the movements of herds, timing the approach, and managing the distribution of food afterward. Each of these steps reinforced trust and reciprocity, weaving the fabric of early society. Through shared labor, the early humans of Africa learned interdependence, and with it came empathy, memory, and communication. The development of mind followed the development of hand. Each refined the other. Over time, the accumulation of skills and cooperation created the foundation for symbolic thought. Though true art and language would arise later, their roots lie here in the rhythmic clatter of stones and the quiet glow of evening fires. Africa's restless climates and rugged geology had forced its inhabitants to invent, to adjust, to share what they knew. Every flood, every drought, every eruption became a lesson. The same tectonic forces that shaped the land shaped the species that learned to live upon it. By transforming raw stone into purpose, early humans had transformed themselves. They no longer merely inhabited the continent, they interacted with it, consciously altering its materials, and in doing so altering their destiny. From this exchange between hand and landscape, between need and imagination, the story of humanity advanced another step toward awareness. Africa's landscapes have never been a single continuous expanse of uniform life. They have always been divided by barriers of climate and topography, forming natural islands scattered across the continent. During the long cycles of glacial cooling and interglacial warmth, these islands grew and shrank, connecting and separating in endless rhythm. Forest retreated into highland pockets, lakes evaporated into salt flats, and grasslands spread across basins before withdrawing again into narrow belts of fertility. For millions of years, this repeating pattern of isolation and reconnection governed the continent's ecology and ultimately the evolution of the human lineage. When the great rains fell, wetlands linked distant valleys, and animal populations mingled freely. Genes spread widely through migration, blending traits and innovations. When the dry winds returned, deserts expanded and those same populations became stranded in smaller refuges cut off by arid plains or mountain walls. Each refuge became an evolutionary island where adaptation proceeded along unique paths. The alternation between expansion and contraction created cycles of divergence and convergence, shaping both biodiversity and human ancestry. The African rift valleys, with their chains of lakes and volcanoes, illustrate this process vividly. In wetter epochs, the great basins of Turkana, Tanganyika and Malawi filled to overflowing, forming inland seas, hundreds of kilometers long. Fish, crocodiles and aquatic birds spread between them, and early human groups could travel along green corridors of vegetation and water. When climates dried, those same basins shrank to isolated lakes or saline pans, and the fertile corridors vanished. Populations that had once interacted were now confined to separate pockets, forced to adapt independently. Genetic studies of modern African fauna revealed deep divergences corresponding to these periods of isolation, and similar patterns are now seen in the ancestry of human populations. Each environmental island became a crucible of variation. Some regions like the Ethiopian highlands, the coastal forests of East Africa, and the wetlands of the Congo Basin remained relatively stable refuges through repeated climate swings. These areas preserved continuity of vegetation and water when surrounding zones turned barren. Other regions, such as the Sahel and the Kalahari, fluctuated more dramatically, alternately supporting rich grasslands or near-desert scrub. In these unstable zones, populations endured intense pressure to move, adapt, or perish. The constant rearrangement of habitats prevented long-term isolation from solidifying into permanent separation, but it was long enough for new traits and behaviors to arise. When wetter conditions returned and the barriers broke down, these differences spread across the continent, enriching the genetic and cultural diversity of the whole. The resulting pattern was not a tree with a single trunk, but a web of interconnected branches, distinct yet always overlapping. This web of isolation and reunion explains why Africa holds the deepest and most complex record of human ancestry. Within its boundaries, early populations of Homo lived diverged and merged again over hundreds of thousands of years. Fossils from Morocco, Ethiopia, Kenya and South Africa each show a mosaic of modern and archaic traits, suggesting that no single region held the key to our species' origin. Instead, humanity emerged from the interaction of multiple populations spread across the continent, linked by intermittent corridors of migration and exchange. These shifting networks of connection were mirrored in culture as well. Tool types, foraging strategies, and settlement patterns show regional variation that waxed and waned with climate. During humid phases, technological traditions spread widely evidence of contact and shared ideas. During arid intervals, innovation became local and distinctive. The archaeological record captures this rhythm, Culean hand axes stretching across vast distances during stable periods, followed by more localized industries as resources fragmented. Each cultural wave rose and fell with the pulse of the environment, binding the story of invention to the rhythm of the land. The isolation imposed by geography was intensified by the ruggedness of Africa's terrain. The high escarpments of the Rift Valley, the vast swamps of the Sud and the deserts of the Sahara all acted as shifting barriers to movement. Yet these obstacles were never absolute. River courses changed, mountain passes opened, and coastlines advanced or retreated, creating new routes for dispersal. Populations followed these pathways, instinctively tracking water and vegetation through changing seasons. In doing so, they maintained a continent-wide dialogue of genes and ideas that prevented any one region from becoming the sole cradle of innovation. The ecological islands thus functioned not as prisons but as laboratories, each conducting its own evolutionary experiments while remaining loosely connected to the wider system. In times of isolations, adaptation became sharper. In times of reunion, diversity combined to form new strengths. This pattern gave Africa an unparalleled capacity for resilience. Unlike other continents where glaciation wiped out entire ecosystems, Africa's environmental patchiness ensured that some refuges always remained habitable. Life could retreat into these pockets and re-expand when conditions improved. The continuity of living communities across millions of years made the continent a constant reservoir of renewal. The evidence of these refuges is written in the distribution of modern species. Endemic birds of the Albertine Rift forest elephants of Central Africa and highland primates of Ethiopia all trace their ancestry to populations that survived within such enclaves during ancient droughts. The same principle applies to humans. Genetic data reveal that the deepest branches of our ancestry diverged within Africa long before any populations left the continent. These divergences correspond to times when climatic extremes split the land into disconnected ecological zones. As aridity expanded, humans retreated into river valleys, highlands, and coastal refuges where resources persisted. When rainfall returned, they spread again, carrying with them genetic and cultural signatures of their separate histories. The result was not a single origin point, but a continental process, an evolution through fragmentation and fusion. The alternation between isolation and mixing fostered cognitive flexibility. To survive in small scattered groups required innovation, memory, and cooperation. When groups met again after long separations, the exchange of knowledge and mates introduced variation that strengthened adaptability. Cultural traditions spread across networks that expanded and contracted like breathing. The diversity of languages, technologies, and genetic lineages found across Africa today still echoes that deep pattern. The continent's internal geography, its mountains, deserts, and basins, thus played the same role as an archipelago plays in the ocean. It created variety through separation and vitality through reconnection. Africa was not one landmass of uniform evolution, but a continent of countless small experiments, each shaped by wind, water, and time. These islands within the land held the continuity of life during global turmoil and released it again when the world softened. From them emerged the resilience and versatility that would define Homo sapiens. The constant interplay between division and reunion, between local innovation and continental exchange, gave rise to a lineage uniquely prepared for uncertainty. Within these scattered refuges, humanity learned endurance. Within their reconnections, it learned cooperation. The genetic tapestry woven by these cycles remains the oldest and richest on Earth, the living memory of a continent that made isolation a source of strength and diversity a law of survival. Across Africa, between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, a transformation took place that would shape the destiny of the species. The transition from archaic humans to anatomically modern Homo sapiens was neither abrupt nor confined to a single location. It unfolded gradually across regions linked by the rhythms of climate and migration. The fossils, tools, and genetic patterns from this period tell a story of evolution distributed across a continent alive with diversity. Rather than a sudden appearance, modern humans emerge through the slow accumulation of changes, biological, behavioral, and ecological, that converged within Africa's dynamic landscapes. The evidence lies scattered across the continent's breadth. In the north at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, fossils dated to more than 300,000 years ago reveal faces and teeth remarkably similar to those of modern humans, yet with elongated skulls reminiscent of earlier forms. In the east, the Omoai remains of Ethiopia, redated to at least 230,000 years ago, display fully modern features: a rounded cranium, delicate brow ridges, and a chin hinting at familiar proportions. In the south, at Florisbad and Border Cave, other individuals show combinations of archaic and modern traits. Together they describe not a single birthplace, but a network of evolving populations. Africa's environmental complexity made such distributed evolution possible. Populations were separated by deserts and mountains during dry periods, then reconnected during humid intervals. Each group experienced different ecological pressures shaping anatomy and genetics in unique ways. Over time, these regional variations blended through migration and interbreeding, producing a continent-wide fusion of traits. The result was a species both unified and diverse, with shared ancestry rooted in the entire landmass. The anatomy of modernity did not arise through isolated innovation, but through connection, through the repeated mixing of populations adapting to varied habitats. Genetic studies confirm this mosaic origin. The deepest branches of human ancestry diverged within Africa hundreds of thousands of years before our species spread elsewhere. The genomes of people living today retain traces of these ancient divisions, evidence of long-term population structure maintained by the continent's patchwork geography. Yet they also reveal continual gene flow, showing that no group remained entirely separate. Evolution within Africa was therefore not linear but reticulate, a braided web of exchange. The same pattern appears in tools and culture. Around this time, Middle Stone Age technologies replaced the earlier Acheulean tradition. Stoneworkers began producing smaller, more refined points and blades, often using prepared core techniques that required planning and precision. These innovations appear almost simultaneously in multiple regions: East Africa, Southern Africa, and the Maghreb, suggesting parallel development within connected networks rather than diffusion from a single center. The capacity for abstract planning reflected in these technologies mirrors the anatomical shift toward larger, more complex brains. The human skull was becoming globular, accommodating expanded frontal regions associated with cognition, communication, and foresight. The face flattened, the brow ridges reduced, and the body proportions lengthened for endurance in warm climates. Each of these changes contributed to adaptability, the central theme of Africa's evolutionary story. The transition to modern anatomy also coincided with behavioral transformation. Stone points were hafted onto wooden shafts to form spears, allowing hunting from a distance. Pigments perhaps used for marking bodies or tools appear in cave deposits. Shell beads and engraved ochres found at sites like Blombos and Pinnacle Point hint at symbolic expression, though these behaviors varied regionally and evolved over tens of thousands of years. The seeds of art and culture were being planted within communities that already possessed the physical framework of modern humanity. The continent's climatic volatility continued to drive these innovations. Between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, Africa experienced repeated oscillations between humid and arid states. Each shift altered resource distribution and forced populations to reorganize. In wetter intervals, expanded river systems and grasslands allowed movement and interaction. In drier periods, isolation promoted local specialization. These alternating conditions reinforced the interplay between genetic divergence and cultural exchange. The result was a species capable of surviving extremes not by uniformity, but by variability itself. The fossil record bears the imprint of this flexibility. The earliest Homo sapiens skeletons show wide variation in skull shape, limb proportions, and stature, yet all share a suite of features that distinguish them from earlier humans. This variability reflects adaptation to different climates, taller, leaner bodies in the tropics, shorter, sturdier frames in cooler highlands. The anatomy of modern humans was not a fixed blueprint but a range of possibilities. What united these populations was not morphology alone but shared behavioral potential, the ability to innovate, communicate and cooperate in response to change. Africa's diverse environments became the testing ground for these abilities. In the savannas, cooperative hunting and resource sharing demanded planning and empathy. Along lake shores and coasts, foraging for shellfish and fish required knowledge of tides and seasons. In forests, tool use and navigation called for memory and spatial awareness. Each habitat rewarded different skills, yet all contributed to the expansion of cognitive versatility. The evolutionary success of Homo sapiens lay in the ability to integrate these local solutions into a collective repertoire. The continent's interconnectedness ensured that innovations spread and combined. The emergence of modern humans was thus a continental symphony, not a single note. By the time populations in East Africa produced the earliest fossils recognizably modern, the groundwork had already been laid across thousands of generations elsewhere. Morphological refinement paralleled neurological and social evolution. Brains grew slightly larger, but more importantly reorganized internally. Neural connections supporting language and planning strengthened while the capacity for abstract reasoning deepened. Social structures expanded from small kin groups to wider alliances enabling cooperation across distances. Fire tools and shared memory allowed communities to persist through environmental upheavals that might once have destroyed them. By the close of this period, humans had achieved a new kind of resilience, the power to shape their environment as much as they were shaped by it. The anatomical changes were visible, but the true transformation lay in cognition and cooperation. The same forces that had fractured the continent into refuges and corridors now united it through communication and movement. Each population carried pieces of the whole, and their merging produced the genetic and cultural foundation of the species that would one day populate the globe. The story of this transformation, written in bone and stone, reveals Africa as both cradle and crucible. Within its deserts, forests, coasts and highlands, evolution experimented endlessly, testing the limits of flexibility until the combination of form and mind reached a new equilibrium. Modern humans were not born in a single place or moment, but forged through the continent's constant dialogue between isolation and connection. Africa's ancient geography, its restless climate and its unbroken continuity made possible the emergence of a being whose defining feature would be adaptability itself. By the time, anatomically, modern humans were established across Africa, their physical form had become familiar, yet it was behavior that distinguished them most profoundly from all who came before. The continent, still shaped by shifting monsoons and restless rifts, provided both the pressure and the opportunity for cognitive expansion. Between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, scattered populations began to exhibit habits that revealed an inner life of thought and planning. The landscapes that had already forged their anatomy now refined their minds. The archaeological record shows that these early Homo sapiens were not confined to one type of environment. They lived in coastal caves, river valleys, upland forests and arid plains, exploiting each habitat with precision. In regions such as southern Africa's Cape Coast, people gathered shellfish, used fire to process food, and selected ochre pigments that they ground into powders, perhaps for body decoration, perhaps for symbolic marking. In the highlands and rift basins of East Africa, they crafted blades, points and scrapers from obsidian and quartz, organizing workshops around consistent designs. Each of these activities implies forward planning, communication and memory, an awareness of materials, seasons and cooperation. This behavioral sophistication was not uniform or sudden, but appeared in pulses matching the continent's climatic rhythms. When conditions were favorable, populations expanded, sharing innovations through trade and social contact. When drought returned, they contracted into refugees where ideas and genes mixed in concentrated exchanges. The pattern of connection and isolation already seen in anatomy now played out in culture. The continuity of these habits through countless generations hunting, gathering, crafting, painting, sharing shows that behavior itself had become the enduring thread of evolution. The making of tools grew increasingly systematic. Middle Stone Age industries show refined flaking techniques that required mental templates and standard sequences of motion. These methods reveal an understanding of cause and effect beyond immediate need. The toolmaker could imagine the final product before striking the first blow, coordinating mind and muscle across time. Such foresight mirrored the challenges of the environment where predicting seasonal changes or animal migrations could mean survival. Learning these skills demanded teaching, observation, and patience. The transmission of technique from one generation to the next created continuity, more lasting than any physical feature. In this sense, knowledge became a heritable trait passed through language and demonstration rather than through genes. Communication itself likely deepened in this period. Gestures, calls, and shared attention evolved toward more structured forms of speech. The demands of cooperation, coordinating hunts, dividing resources, instructing children required nuance and flexibility. The ability to use words and syntax allowed humans to plan together, to warn of danger, to share ideas beyond the present moment. Speech turned memory into strategy. Around campfires or beneath shelters, people could recount past journeys and anticipate future ones, weaving narrative into survival. The appearance of symbolic expression supports this shift. At Blombos Cave and Still Bay, engraved ochre plaques, shell beads, and geometric carvings dated to roughly 75,000 years ago indicate that humans had begun to use abstraction to represent identity and belonging. These markings served no immediate practical function, but carried meaning recognized by others, evidence of social awareness and imagination. The emergence of ornamentation parallels the growth of group identity, suggesting that humans were learning to see themselves as members of communities defined by shared signs. Such behaviors show that cognition had reached a level where the external world could be mirrored and reinterpreted within the mind. This new capacity did not erase earlier traditions but integrated them. The practical knowledge of hunting, gathering, and tool-making merged with symbolic awareness, producing a flexible culture capable of rapid adaptation. When climates changed and habitats shifted, cultural memory preserved the methods that had worked before. The combination of innovation and continuity allowed humans to survive conditions that might once have been fatal. The African environment continued to test this resilience. Between 130,000 and 70,000 years ago, cycles of drought and abundance grew intense. In some regions, lakes evaporated completely. In others, forests advanced over grasslands. Populations retreated to coasts and highlands, where fresh water and food remained reliable. Genetic evidence suggests that during the most severe dry intervals, the total number of humans on Earth may have dwindled to a few thousand individuals. Yet these small groups carried within them the full inheritance of behavioral modernity. They maintained fire-crafted tools and exchanged symbolic goods, ensuring that when conditions improved, the species could rebound swiftly. The persistence of these practices through near collapse illustrates their deep integration into human life. Africa's variety of ecosystems encouraged further specialization. In the savannas, Hunters pursued antelope and zebra using coordinated strategies that depended on communication and endurance. In wetlands and river deltas, people fished and gathered aquatic plants, developing technologies suited to water-barbed points, traps, and woven baskets. Along coasts, shell middens testify to a reliance on marine resources, an adaptation that would later facilitate migration beyond Africa. Each region's culture reflected its environment, yet shared common principles, cooperation, planning, and memory. This diversity within unity became the hallmark of the species. The ecological mosaics that had long defined the continent now found expression in the diversity of human life ways. The use of pigment and ornament, the burial of the dead, and the care for injured individuals all indicate an emotional dimension to survival. Compassion, ritual, and imagination emerged as extensions of social cohesion. Caring for the vulnerable improved group success, while ritual reinforced identity during hardship. These behaviors show that selection was acting not only on strength or dexterity, but on empathy and understanding. The ability to anticipate the needs of others became as valuable as the ability to strike stone. The same environmental uncertainty that had once favored mobility now favored cooperation and foresight. Within groups that shared resources, survival no longer depended solely on the individual, but on the network of trust that bound the group together. Africa's long history of fragmentation and reconnection had taught this lesson repeatedly. Those who adapted together endured. Over time, cumulative learning transformed culture into a second inheritance system. Techniques and stories crossed generations as reliably as genetic traits. This cultural continuity explains why, despite local variation, the fundamental patterns of human behavior remain recognizable across time. The making of fire, the shaping of tools, the gathering around shared food, these acts established deep in Africa's past persist as the foundation of human society. By the close of this period, roughly 100,000 years ago, modern humans had spread across the continent from the coasts of the Atlantic to the savannas of the Rift and the deserts of the North. They occupied nearly every environment their technologies and social systems adapted to each. Behavior had become the true marker of modernity, flexible, inventive, and enduring. The continent that had forged their bodies had now completed the shaping of their minds. Within Africa's endless variability, humanity had discovered stability not in the land, but within itself, in the capacity to remember, to teach, and to imagine what might come next. As the restless climate of Africa continued its cycles of aridity and renewal, water remained the single element that dictated the rhythm of life. Rivers, lakes, and coasts became the continent's arteries linking habitats and carrying both life and memory through time. For early Homo sapiens, these watery corridors were not obstacles but lifelines, routes of migration, communication, and sustenance. They threaded through deserts, split mountains, and traced the edges of continents, providing the continuity that land alone could not. Water shaped human evolution as profoundly as stone and fire. In the highlands and rift valleys, freshwater lakes fluctuated with the climate, alternately swelling to inland seas and retreating into isolated pools. The great basins of Turkana, Victoria, and Malawi filled and emptied in rhythm with the monsoon cycles. Each expansion transformed the surrounding landscape into a lush mosaic of floodplains and wetlands rich in vegetation, fish, and game. When the lakes contracted, they left behind fertile soils and concentrated resources, drawing humans and animals alike to their shrinking shores. Archaeological sites along these ancient lake margins record repeated human presence, stone flakes, hearths, and bones etched with tool marks, evidence of communities returning generation after generation to the same dependable places. These basins acted as gathering points where populations mingled, exchanged tools and ideas, and perhaps intermarried, renewing genetic diversity that might otherwise have been lost during long droughts. The shifting lakes also forced mobility, compelling groups to explore new territories as waterlines moved. This constant movement cultivated adaptability, teaching humans to read the land for clues of moisture and to navigate vast spaces in search of sustenance. The same principle held true for rivers. The Nile, Congo, Niger, and Zambezi served as moving highways through time, each born from rainfall patterns shaped by tectonic uplift and monsoon flow. Along their banks, vegetation flourished even during arid phases, creating continuous green corridors through regions that otherwise turned to dust. Early humans followed these waterways as they spread across the continent. The Nile linked the tropical heartlands with the Mediterranean. The Congo connected highlands to the Atlantic. The Rift Valley rivers guided migration between basins. These riverine networks provided more than water, they offered direction. Their predictable flow taught orientation and timing, forming the natural geometry of migration. Animals migrated along them, fish spawned in their deltas, and humans learned to synchronize their movements with these ancient patterns. The dependence on freshwater shaped technology and diet. Spears tipped with bone and stone appear near lake shores, suggesting specialized hunting of fish and aquatic animals. Hearths contain charred shells and remains of catfish and tilapia species still common today. The exploitation of aquatic resources provided nutritional stability in times when terrestrial game was scarce. It also encouraged the development of tools suited to both land and water, further expanding the human ecological niche. The mastery of water's abundance and scarcity mirrored the mastery of change itself. Nowhere was this relationship more profound than along Africa's coasts. As sea levels rose and fell with the growth and melting of distant ice sheets, the boundaries between land and ocean shifted by hundreds of kilometers. During low sea stands, broad coastal plains extended far into what is now the continental shelf, exposing rivers, dunes and lagoons that provided fertile ground for foraging. When seas advanced, these plains were submerged, but new shorelines formed in their place, rich with shellfish and marine life. Early humans followed these transformations, learning to exploit tidal cycles and marine ecosystems. Sites such as Pinnacle Point Clazy's River and Mumbwa Cave preserve evidence of shell harvesting and the controlled use of fire for cooking. These coastal populations represent some of the earliest examples of sustained resource management, demonstrating a deep understanding of seasonal cycles and long-term planning. Living at the edge of land and sea also fostered navigation skills and spatial awareness that would later prove essential for dispersal beyond Africa. The coasts served as corridors not only of movement, but of memory, preserving continuity, even as interior regions fluctuated between drought and fertility. The rhythmic sound of waves, the constancy of tides, and the reliability of marine resources provided stability in a world otherwise governed by unpredictability. Along these shores, humans began to form patterns of settlement that reflected both permanence and mobility, temporary camps reused across generations oriented around freshwater springs or shell middens. These were not yet villages, but they hinted at a growing attachment to place a recognition that certain landscapes could be revisited and depended upon. The connection between water and culture deepened as humans began to associate water with renewal and continuity. Springs and river mouths became focal points for gathering trade and ritual. Fossil evidence shows that even as populations dispersed across the continent, they often remain tethered to these aquatic environments. Genetic studies indicate that regions adjacent to major waterways hosted dense and continuous populations, acting as reservoirs of human diversity during times when drier interiors became uninhabitable. the presence of reliable water sources not only sustained life, but also preserved the lineages that would later expand across the globe. The ecological influence of these corridors extended beyond sustenance. Water moderated temperature, creating microclimates that buffered extremes. Plants flourished along their margins, attracting animals and providing materials for shelter and tool-making. Insects and birds followed their courses, linking ecosystems across vast distances. For humans, these patterns were cues in a living map of the continent, a network of signals that could be read and remembered. The ability to interpret these signs, cloud formations, animal tracks, soil, moisture, became a form of early geography passed through stories and observation. The knowledge of where water could be found and when it would return was as critical as the tools used to exploit it. Over millennia, this knowledge accumulated into a collective memory embedded within human culture. When modern humans began to expand outward from Africa, it was likely these freshwater and coastal routes that guided their passage. The same instincts and traditions that had carried their ancestors from one drying lake to another now led them along the Red Sea, across the Horn of Africa, and eventually beyond. The corridors that had sustained evolution within the continent became pathways of migration into new worlds. Water had taught humanity movement, patience, and renewal. Now it offered escape and expansion. In its flow lay both memory and destiny. The rivers and coasts of Africa were never merely features of geography, they were instruments of continuity through time. They linked scattered populations, preserved life during hardship, and shaped the patterns of behavior that endure even today. Settlement near water travel, along its course reverence for its return. From the first ripples of rain to the tidal pulse of the ocean, water bound the continent together and prepared its people to cross the boundaries of the known world. By the time the climate of Africa settled into the rhythms that define the late Pleistocene Homo sapiens had become fully modern in body and mind. Populations were distributed across the continent, connected by rivers, coasts, and corridors of vegetation that waxed and waned with the monsoons. Within this shifting network, humans learned to read the signs of the earth, the direction of wind, the shimmer of distant water, the patterns of animal migration, and to move when the balance tipped towards scarcity. Around 100,000 years ago, environmental conditions opened the first passages beyond Africa. Yet these migrations were not single exoduses, but a series of dispersals shaped by the same forces that had guided movement within the continent for millennia. The story of humanity's outward path is thus an extension of Africa's internal dialogue with change. The initial window for expansion came through the northeastern corner of the continent, where the Nile Valley met the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula beyond. During wetter intervals, the Sahara was not a desert, but a vast mosaic of grasslands and lakes dotted with rivers that connected the Mediterranean coast to the interior. Fossil riverbeds and lake sediments reveal hippos, crocodiles, and antelopes once inhabiting areas now barren. These green corridors would have allowed humans to move northward without crossing true desert. From there, the coasts of the Red Sea provided a natural highway toward Arabia. At low sea levels, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb narrowed to a few kilometers, perhaps shallow enough to be crossed with simple rafts or even on foot across islands. Archaeological evidence from sites in Israel and the Arabian Peninsula shows the presence of early modern humans outside Africa by about 100 to 120,000 years ago, though these populations may have retreated during later arid phases. Their presence demonstrates that dispersal was not a singular event but a recurring possibility dependent on climate. Each humid phase offered new openings, each dry period closed them again. Africa itself remained the heart of the species, continually repopulating the routes outward. genetic evidence supports this ebb and flow. The deepest lineages of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome variation trace back to multiple regions within Africa, converging on a common ancestry but diverging across time. The small fraction of this diversity that exists outside Africa today reflects the expansion of only a subset of populations, probably those inhabiting the eastern and southern coasts around 70 to 60,000 years ago. These groups carried with them the technologies, behaviours and symbolic traditions that had matured over thousands of years on African soil. Their dispersal did not mark a break with the continent, but its extension into new environments. Before leaving, humans had already adapted to the extremes of Africa's climate, to deserts, forests and highlands. This versatility prepared them for the challenges beyond. The outward path followed. Familiar principles seek water, follow coasts, exploit variety. Along the shores of the Indian Ocean, people moved gradually eastward, living from shellfish, fish and game, using the same fire and stone tools that had served them at home. This coastal adaptation, first refined in southern Africa, became the bridge between continents. Inland, the expansion continued through river valleys and highland routes. Populations radiated into North Africa, where humid pulses supported rich savannas, and into the western corridors linking the Niger and Senegal basins. Some groups moved southward as well, occupying the Cape regions and adapting to cool variable climates. The entire continent pulsed with motion, each group connected by exchanges of genes and culture. The outward movement was therefore not a migration of desperation, but of opportunity driven by curiosity, population growth, and the search for stability. The same intelligence that had allowed survival through Africa's climatic swings now encouraged exploration. Archaeological sites across Africa's coasts and interior show increasing complexity during this period. Organised campsites, hearths reused over centuries, and evidence of long-distance transport of materials such as obsidian and marine shells. These activities reflect social networks that extended far beyond immediate family groups. Exchange and cooperation, essential for surviving environmental fluctuation, had become integral to human life. Such connections would prove vital as small bands ventured into new territories. Each movement outward was supported by inherited knowledge, how to make fire-shaped tools, recognize edible plants, and interpret the sky for direction. These skills represented the cumulative memory of countless generations who had learned from the continent itself. When humans crossed into Asia, and later into Europe and Oceania, they carried with them Africa's legacy of adaptation and its capacity for renewal. Yet not all movement was outward. Within Africa, populations continued to shift, merge and diversify. The Sahara repeatedly alternated between habitable savanna and forbidding desert, regulating contact between North and Sub-Saharan populations. The western coasts opened and closed with sea levels guiding migrations along the Atlantic margin. Southern Africa's refugees maintained continuity during harsh intervals, preserving genetic and cultural depth. Thus, while some groups left the continent, others remained, continuing to evolve within familiar but ever-changing landscapes. The outward dispersal did not drain Africa of its diversity. It exported a small fraction of it, leaving behind the richest store of genetic variation on Earth. This depth explains why every human population today, regardless of distance, still carries echoes of those ancient African ancestors. The outward path also marks the beginning of humanity's planetary scale, yet the essence of that expansion remained rooted in the lessons of home. Water, fire and stone continue to guide survival. Cooperation and imagination continue to define success. The journey across deserts and seas was only possible because Africa had trained its people in endurance and curiosity. The genetic threads of all modern humans still converge on the same continental tapestry, woven by those who first learned to adapt to shifting worlds. Africa's position at the intersection of continents made it both cradle and crossroads. The tectonic rifts, monsoons, and ocean currents that once shaped evolution within its boundaries also connected it to the wider planet. The Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula, the Sinai and the Mediterranean, the Horn and the Indian Ocean, all became extensions of Africa's landscape. As climates permitted, humans moved through them as naturally as they had moved between basins and highlands within the continent. These pathways remind us that dispersal was not a heroic leap into the unknown, but a continuation of ancient patterns of exploration ingrained by survival. Even after populations established themselves beyond Africa, the continent remained their point of reference, the reservoir from which genetic and cultural renewal would flow. The outward path, therefore, was not an end but a phase in the continuum of movement that had defined human existence from the start. Africa taught humanity to live with flux, to find opportunity in instability, and to maintain connection across distance. As the first travellers gazed back across the waters separating them from their ancestral land, the lessons of that land were already inscribed in their bodies and minds: endurance, cooperation, and the memory of home. The emergence of modern humans in Africa raises a question that reaches beyond geography. Why here and not elsewhere? The planet of the late Pleistocene was vast and varied. Other continents held fertile plains, forests and rivers teeming with life. Yet it was Africa that nurtured the complex interplay of stability and disturbance required for evolutionary transformation. The answer lies in the continent's unique combination of geological endurance, climatic variability, and ecological continuity, a balance that created both challenge and refuge. Nowhere else sustained such long unbroken sequences of habitability, nor such rhythmic cycles of change that continually tested and refined adaptability. Africa's ancient cratons provided a stable platform on which ecosystems could evolve without being erased by glaciation or subduction. In Europe and North America, advancing ice sheets repeatedly scoured the land, extinguishing entire lineages and forcing recolonization from distant refugees. Asia experienced vast climatic extremes and continental collisions that created deserts and high mountain barriers. Africa, by contrast, remained largely free of ice, its equatorial position ensuring that life could persist even during global cold phases. The absence of complete resets allowed evolutionary processes to accumulate rather than restart. Over hundreds of millions of years, plants and animals co-evolved in place, building intricate networks of interaction. When the hominin lineage emerged, it did so within an ecosystem already rich in complexity, shaped by continuity rather than catastrophe. Yet continuity alone could not explain the rise of adaptability. For that variation was needed. Africa's climate provided it in abundance. The continent straddles the equator, spanning both hemispheres, and thus receives the full oscillation of Earth's orbital rhythms. The monsoon systems shift north and south, with the seasons their intensity waxing and waning over tens of thousands of years. These changes alter rainfall, vegetation, and temperature on a continental scale, creating a pattern of alternating wet and dry phases that has persisted for millions of years. No other region has experienced such long-term environmental instability, coupled with biological continuity. This combination of steady existence and relentless change forged life forms that could endure uncertainty. The evolutionary record shows that major bursts of speciation among mammals, birds, and primates align with periods of heightened climatic fluctuation. The same pattern shaped human evolution, bursts of innovation, and dispersal followed intervals of stress and fragmentation. Africa's variability functioned like a vast natural laboratory in which flexibility itself was the trait most strongly selected. Beyond climate and geology, the structure of African ecosystems contributed to this uniqueness. The continent's patchwork of biomes, forest, savanna, desert, and wetland, exists in close proximity, often within a single region. This ecological compression created constant interaction between habitats and species. Populations living only kilometers apart experienced dramatically different conditions, yet the boundaries between them were permeable. Animals and humans could move freely when circumstances allowed, but local differences always persisted. The result was a mosaic of isolation and contact that promoted both diversification and gene flow. Elsewhere, environments tended to be more homogeneous over large areas, or separated by impassable barriers limiting the fine-scale interplay of adaptation and exchange. In Africa, the landscape itself invited experimentation. It rewarded movement awareness and the capacity to thrive in more than one world. Predators and prey alike evolved under this principle, sharpening intelligence and coordination as much as physical strength. For hominins, this meant the steady refinement of cognition and cooperation, shaped by an environment that never allowed complacency. Another key factor was the scale of faunal continuity. Africa retained its megafauna throughout the Pleistocene, whereas most other continents lost theirs to climatic or human-induced extinctions. The persistence of large mammals maintained ecological complexity and selective pressure. Living among elephants, lions, and other formidable species required awareness, strategy, and group coordination. In regions where such pressures disappeared, evolutionary challenges changed or diminished. Africa's ecosystems remained dense, with competition continually reinforcing adaptability and learning. Its communities of herbivores and carnivores formed moving landscapes of opportunity and risk that kept human ingenuity sharp. Geography further amplified Africa's distinct role. Surrounded by oceans yet connected to Eurasia by narrow corridors, the continent functioned as both cradle and crossroads. It received returning migrations of animals and early humans, but filtered them through its own climatic and ecological regimes. The rift valleys and plateaus created gradients of temperature and rainfall that mirrored those found on a planetary scale, allowing evolutionary processes to unfold within confined regions. Yet this internal diversity made Africa a miniature world, a self-contained arena that reproduced the challenges of global environments. When humans later dispersed, they were already equipped to handle a wide range of conditions because they had evolved in a land that contained many worlds within it. Africa's deep time also played a role. Its geological history stretches back more than 3 billion years, and through that immense span it has preserved soils, sediments, and habitats that record life's continuity. Nutrient cycles stabilized by ancient rocks sustained rich vegetation, supporting herbivores and omnivores even during dry intervals. Rivers originating from uplifted highlands carried minerals across vast basins, fertilizing floodplains that revived quickly after drought. The constancy of these processes ensured that even when climates shifted, the basic foundations of productivity remained. Food chains adapted, but they rarely collapsed. Such resilience created a dependable backdrop for evolutionary experimentation. Over generations, Africa's inhabitants, plants, animals, and humans became specialists in unpredictability. The continent's complexity also fostered cultural continuity, because its environments were connected rather than isolated by geography. Technological and social innovations could spread without the need for long-distance migration. Stone tool industries' use of fire and symbolic expression appeared independently in multiple regions but remained recognizable across vast distances. Africa's populations shared a web of interaction that kept cultural evolution active even during times of environmental fragmentation. When humid phases returned, these traditions mingled and multiplied, accelerating progress. Elsewhere, smaller and more isolated populations were more vulnerable to extinction or stagnation. Africa's scale and diversity protected the flow of ideas just as it protected the flow of genes. Another reason lies in the way Africa's ecosystem linked to global processes. Its monsoons influence the atmospheric circulation of the entire planet. Dust from the Sahara fertilizes oceans and distant rainforests. Moisture rising from the Congo Basin contributes to equatorial rainfall belts. The continent's climate variability is both local and planetary, meaning that evolutionary events within Africa have always been tied to Earth's broader systems. The forces shaping humanity there were therefore not isolated phenomena, but reflections of global patterns concentrated in one place. Africa's uniqueness then lies not in isolation, but in integration. The way its landscapes, climate, and life formed a self-renewing system of feedback and response. Other continents experienced glaciation, desertification, or stability, but none combined all three in such measure or for such duration. Within this dynamic equilibrium, Homo sapiens was not a fluke, but a predictable outcome of continual adaptation. The continent's balance of change and continuity selected for awareness, cooperation, and imagination, the traits that define modern humanity. Africa alone sustained the long apprenticeship necessary for these qualities to mature. Its rivers and coasts guided movement, its rifts and mountains provided challenge, its climates imposed discipline, and its continuity offered refuge. The rest of the world would, one day, host the descendants of these experiments, but the pattern itself was African, the template of resilience forged in the only place where endurance and instability coexisted long enough to shape a truly adaptable mind. The story of humanity's African origin rests on an immense body of evidence drawn from stone, bone, soil, and gene. Yet even now, as new fossils emerge and genetic data deepen, questions remain about how and when the many strands of evolution intertwined into what we call modern humanity. Africa's fossil record is vast but fragmentary, a jigsaw built across millions of years and thousands of kilometers. Its pieces come from caves, rift basins, river terraces, and ancient dunes, each preserving a moment in the continent's long experiment with life. Together they reveal a pattern of continuity shaped by motion, and change, a record that is both clear in outline and veiled in detail. In the deserts of Morocco, the faces from Jebel Ehud speak of modern traits at least 300,000 years old. In Ethiopia, the Homo skeleton shows the rounded cranium and slender build of Homo sapiens at 230,000 years. In South Africa, Florisbad's partial skull carries both archaic and modern elements, while Border Cave preserves individuals who by 90,000 years ago were unmistakably human in form and habit. Across these finds runs a thread of variation that defies the idea of a single birthplace. The fossils mark a continent-wide transformation rather than a local event. Each population contributed its own features refined by environment and interbreeding until the whole became the species we recognize today. The discovery of fossils in new regions often redraws boundaries once thought settled. The more we learn, the more intricate the pattern becomes. Layers of sediment reveal shifting lakes and changing fauna, showing how climate pulsed in tune with orbital rhythms. Volcanic ash provides precise dates for the transitions tying human evolution to the cycles of Earth's motion around the Sun. The The fossils confirm what the geology suggests, that Africa's constant variability was the backdrop against which intelligence, cooperation and symbolic life emerged. The archaeological record complements the bones. Stone tools trace the rhythm of innovation from the heavy Acheulean hand axes of early humans to the refined blades and points of the Middle Stone Age. In southern Africa, at sites like Blombos and Clayses River, engraved ochres and shell ornaments testify to abstract thought. In East Africa, obsidian workshops show networks of exchange that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Each artifact records not just function, but intention, the capacity to imagine, to plan and to share. These technological signatures appear at different times in different places, their overlap forming a web of innovation that covered the continent long before humans left it. The genetic record adds another layer. Modern sequencing techniques reveal that all living humans descend from populations that lived within Africa between roughly 300,000 and 60,000 years ago. Yet the pattern is not one of simple descent, but of branching and rejoining. Populations diverged in isolation, then met again as climates shifted, exchanging genes, in a cycle that maintained both diversity and unity. The deepest genetic lineages today are found among groups such as the San of southern Africa and the Hadza of East Africa, whose ancestry reaches back to the earliest divisions of our species. These lineages do not represent ancient tribes frozen in time, but survivors of a genetic continuity that endured countless transformations. Their DNA preserves echoes of a shared past stretching far beyond the memory of language or myth. The same analyses show that when small groups of humans left Africa roughly 70,000 years ago, they carried only a portion of this genetic diversity. The variation found outside the continent is a subset of the richness that remained within. This asymmetry underscores Africa's centrality. It is not merely the place where humans began, but where most of human history unfolded. The continent's genetic depth is a living archive of evolution encoded in every generation. Still, many mysteries persist. The fossil gaps between archaic humans and early Homo sapiens are wide, partly because geological activity and tropical conditions erase bone faster than they preserve it. Entire regions remain unexplored, their ancient sediments buried beneath forests or dunes. What we know may be only a small fraction of what once existed. Each new discovery has the power to shift timelines by tens of thousands of years, reminding us that our understanding is provisional. The same uncertainty surrounds behavior. Symbolic artifacts reveal flashes of imagination. But when did language truly arise, and how was it first used? Did it evolve once spreading with our species or emerge repeatedly among separate populations? How far did early humans travel within Africa before moving beyond it? These questions remain open, suspended between evidence and possibility. Yet even in uncertainty, patterns emerge. The convergence of data from fossils, tools, and genetics points to a single consistent theme: adaptability. Every line of evidence reinforces the idea that flexibility rather than specialization was the key to survival. Humans thrived not because they mastered one environment, but because they could adjust to many. Africa's landscapes provided both the test and the teacher. Its rift valleys offered shelter during droughts, its coasts sustained life during cold phases, and its lakes mirrored the sky's cycles, reminding each generation that change was constant. The evidence also reveals continuity amid dispersal. Even after humans spread into Eurasia, Africa remained a center of innovation. Genetic flow between returning and resident populations continued well into recent prehistory, blurring the line between inside and outside. The species that had emerged on this continent remained bound to it by movement and exchange. The African story, therefore, is not only about beginnings, but about persistence, a continuous thread of life adapting through every oscillation of Earth's climate. The unknowns are as significant as the facts. They remind us that evolution is not a completed tale, but an ongoing process. The same geological and climatic forces that shaped our ancestors still sculpt the land and influence life today. The rifts widen imperceptibly each year. The monsoons shift the deserts breathe. The human record within Africa is still being written not in fossils alone, but in the survival of cultures and languages that trace their roots to the deep past. In them lives the echo of those first adaptive minds shaped by uncertainty and bound by cooperation. Africa remains not just the place of origin, but the enduring context of humanity, the living landscape that continues to host the diversity of form and thought it once created. Every excavation, every genome and every discovery brings us closer to understanding, yet each answer opens new questions. That balance between knowledge and mystery reflects the very nature of evolution itself. From its ancient rocks to its modern people, Africa embodies continuity within change, the principle that life endures by transforming. The evidence grounds us in fact. The unknowns remind us of time's immensity. Together they form the final lesson of our beginning, that the continent which shaped us still shapes the questions we ask about ourselves.